You definitely didn't know this about American history. Winter on the American frontier wasn't just a season, it was a silent predator. A wall of ice and wind that cut settlers off from the rest of the world. The Great Plains and foothills of the Rocky Mountains turned into a white desert, where temperatures could drop to unimaginable lows and blizzards could last for weeks. Surviving in these conditions in a hastily built cabin wasn't just a task, it was a daily battle. Every piece of wood, every scrap of fabric, every stored root vegetable became a strategic resource. The cozy image of a pioneer by the hearth is just one side of the coin. The other side is the constant battle against invisible enemies, piercing drafts, freezing water, and the psychological pressure of confined space. It was a battle for warmth, where the hearth was the heart of the home, but also its most demanding inhabitant. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn which often overlooked element of the house was more important than the thickness of the walls and how a mistake in its construction could cost settlers everything. I will reveal the most guarded survival secret of pioneers, which had nothing to do with weapons or food. This secret was the unceasing war with the air. Settlers knew that the real enemy wasn't the cold outside, but the slightest movement of icy air inside the cabin. Most log cabins, especially those built in haste, weren't airtight. Gaps between the logs turned into icy highways for the wind. These cracks could undo all the work of the hearth, drawing out warmth and letting in the cold. The process of sealing these gaps was called chinking and was one of the most important autumn tasks. Any available material that could fill the space was used. Most often, moss, clay, or dried grass were employed. This work was never finished. Clay dried, cracked from the frost, and fell out. Moss shrank and stopped being an effective sealant. Families had to constantly inspect the walls and seal new breaches. To create a more durable mixture, pioneers often made a special compound. They mixed clay with straw, grass, or even horsehair to create a reinforcing layer. This improvised cob held up better and cracked less. The floor and roof were equally vulnerable. Wind could penetrate gaps in the floorboards if the house had no foundation. On the attic and roof, frost collected, melted, and dripped, creating dampness. The weakest points were, of course, the doors and windows. If a settler was lucky enough to have glass, the frame was rarely airtight. More often than not, window openings were simply covered with oiled paper or cloth. To block these drafts, heavy quilts or old hides were hung over window and door openings. This created an additional heat barrier. Sometimes the walls were completely covered with old newspapers or catalog pages from the inside, if available. The constant whistling of the wind through the cracks was a psychological reminder of how thin the barrier between life and cold was. Fighting drafts wasn't a one-time action, but a constant methodical process, and survival depended on it. This constant battle with the details was the foundation of survival. What do you think would be the hardest thing about such isolation for a modern person? Share your opinion in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our stories. Are you ready to learn the truth about how homes were actually built on the frontier and why the famous log cabin wasn't always the best choice? The romantic image of the log cabin became deeply rooted in culture, but it was only a reality where there was wood. On the vast Great Plains, there simply was no wood for building. Settlers arriving in Nebraska, Kansas, or Dakota faced an ocean of grass. The only building material available was the earth itself. This led to the creation of the soddy, a unique dwelling of the American frontier. A special plow was used to cut long strips of sod. These strips were then chopped into bricks weighing tens of kilograms. The roots of the tall prairie grasses were so tightly woven that these bricks were incredibly durable. The walls were made from these sod bricks, arranged with the grass side down. The thickness of the walls could reach a meter. This made the construction incredibly heavy and resistant to the hurricane winds of the plains. The roof was the most complicated part. First, rare wooden beams were laid, which had to be brought from afar at great expense. Then a layer of branches and grass was placed on top, followed by another layer of sod. This earth-built house had phenomenal insulating properties. The thick walls blocked the icy wind. Inside the soddy, it was relatively warm in winter and cool in summer. These houses were also virtually fireproof. This was a life-saving advantage on the prairie, where grass fires were common and terrifying. Fire could race across the soddy without damaging it. Of course, these homes also had significant drawbacks. The roofs almost always leaked during heavy rains or spring thaws. Dirt and dust constantly fell from the ceiling and walls. In forested areas like the Rocky Mountains or Oregon, settlers, of course, built log cabins. However, their quality greatly depended on the builder's skill. A hastily constructed cabin with round logs was full of gaps, as we've already discussed. Only experienced craftsmen could afford to hew logs into square shapes. These walls fit more tightly and required less chinking. The choice of dwelling wasn't based on desire, but on harsh necessity and geography. Even the thickest walls were useless without a heat source. Want to know how heat from simple cooking turned into a complex heating system?
Here you go, dear. Nice and hot.
It looks good.
What I will show next was a true secret of every housewife on the frontier. Knowledge passed down not from books, but through observation, intuition, and experience. This secret turned the kitchen into the main bastion against the cold, the heart of the house, where the fate of the entire family was decided. In a winter cabin, the kitchen wasn't just a place to prepare food. It was the industrial center, the laboratory, and the heat engine of the home. Life literally boiled here. Every crackle of the log, every piece of coal tossed on the fire contributed to survival. The kitchen was the place where human ingenuity met the harsh nature. With the advent of the cast iron kitchen stove in the mid-19th century, settler life changed beyond recognition. Previously, an open hearth consumed a huge amount of fuel and provided only local heat, but the new stove allowed for more efficient use of the fire's energy. It radiated even heat in all directions, warming the air, walls, and even the floors. Additionally, it was safer. The flames were hidden behind metal doors, reducing the risk of fire. For settlers, this invention was a true technological breakthrough, a symbol of progress that came to the wildlands. The stove became the heart of the home, around which all life revolved. Its surface was always hot, and every family member found their place next to it. Children warmed their hands on the iron sides, men dried their boots after work, and women constantly cooked, tossing logs on the fire and monitoring the temperature. The fire in the stove never went out even at night. It was maintained by glowing embers, so by morning it was easy to rekindle the heat. The family ate, worked, talked, and rested here, in the warmth and flickering light of the flames, rather than in the living room, if one even existed. Frontier housewives, lacking scientific knowledge, intuitively understood the laws of thermodynamics. They knew how to direct heat, slow down energy loss, and make every degree of warmth work for the family's benefit. The stovepipe often ran through the entire house, so that hot air wouldn't escape immediately outside. If the cabin had an attic, the pipe ran through it, warming and drying storage areas for grain and clothing. Thus, even smoke became part of home engineering. Heat loss was minimized and every spark had its purpose. Cooking became not just a household task, but a heating strategy. In winter, the stove was never idle. Even if lunch was already cooked, a pot of boiling water or soup stood on the stove. Every movement of the lid released a cloud of steam that filled the room with warmth and moisture. This was not only comfort but real protection against diseases, as the warm, humid air made breathing easier and prevented the drying out of mucous membranes. Women knew this instinctively, even if they couldn't explain it in words. For them, the kitchen was a living thing that needed to be fed with wood and protected so it could continue to warm. Steam from boiling water was vital. The frosty air outside was not just cold, but mercilessly dry. Inside, where the stove burned day and night, dryness became almost as dangerous. Lips cracked, skin dried, wooden beams creaked, and floorboards squeaked. Constant evaporation from the kettle restored moisture, making the air softer and warmer. The mist of steam hung from the ceiling, creating the illusion of the house breathing. Even plants, if placed by the window, felt better. In every home with tightly shut shutters, Steam became part of the atmosphere, without which survival would be impossible. Baking bread played its own role in this invisible battle with the cold. When the housewife placed dough in the oven, the cast iron chamber absorbed the heat, and the cabin itself turned into a furnace. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with the scent of smoke, and the whole house filled with a sense of peace and safety. Even after the bread was removed, the oven still radiated heat, warming the room. Sometimes women baked at night so that in the morning, the house would be warm and smell like baked goods. Every loaf became not just food, but a defense against winter's chill. Even heavy cast iron irons used for ironing were used with practical ingenuity. They were heated on the stove and then wrapped in fabric or wool, turning them into makeshift heating pads. These irons were placed in the bed an hour before sleep to warm the cold sheets and blankets. Sometimes they were placed at the feet of children to keep them warm during sleep. This simple technique was known to every housewife. It made winter a little softer and cozier. Even in the harshest frost, the house retained the feeling of warmth, earned through hard work and ingenuity. Thus, everyday household tasks became a well-thought-out survival strategy. A frontier woman was not just a housekeeper, but the engineer of home warmth, managing a complex system of heating and comfort. She knew where the stove should be placed, how to direct the smoke, and how to store embers so the heat wouldn't escape. Her work was unceasing, requiring attention and precision, much like a locomotive engineer. But it was this work that ensured the survival of the family. In conditions where every degree of heat could determine the outcome of winter, the role of a woman was not just important, it was life-saving. What if I told you that everything you believed about the cozy hearth of pioneers isn't entirely true? It wasn't just a friend, but a treacherous enemy. In early cabins, built before the advent of cast iron stoves, the open hearth was the only source of heat and light. The construction of the hearth was of critical importance. It was built from any available materials, most often wild field stone bonded with clay mortar. The size of the hearth was enormous, often occupying almost the entire wall. The chimney was the most dangerous part. In many hastily constructed cabins, it was made from a wooden frame covered inside with a thick layer of clay and straw. This structure, known as cat and clay, was simple but extremely fire-prone. Over time, the clay cracked and fell off, exposing the wooden frame. Sparks from the hearth could easily ignite it, and soon the entire roof. A fire in the cabin in the middle of winter was almost as good as death. But the main problem with the hearth was its monstrous inefficiency. An open fire requires a huge amount of oxygen. The hearth acted like a giant pump, drawing warmth out of the room and sucking in icy air through every crack. A paradox arose: the harder the fire burned, the stronger the drafts became. Settlers encountered the hot face, cold back effect. You could burn yourself standing by the fire and simultaneously feel your back freezing. The fire in the hearth was never supposed to go out. If it did, the temperature inside the cabin would drop to outdoor levels in a matter of minutes. This meant that someone from the family had to tend to the fire all night, adding logs. To keep the fire going until morning, a special technique was used. The embers were covered with a thick layer of ash, blocking access to oxygen. This smothering process allowed the embers to smolder until morning without open flames. In the morning, the ash was carefully raked aside, dry kindling placed on the smoldering embers, and the fire was fanned into flame. If the embers went out, fire had to be made from scratch, using flint and steel or, if available, precious matches. The hearth was the demanding heart of the house, giving life, but also draining strength. But what is fire without fuel? In the next chapter, you'll learn the colossal labor behind the simple logs in the fire. Winter survival of the cabin was measured not in calendar days, but by the amount of firewood stacked against the wall. This reserve was the equivalent of life itself. Every piece of wood meant another evening of warmth, another night without fear of the cold. The need for fuel was immense. The open hearth, and later the cast iron stove, working non-stop, consumed not just firewood, they devoured the forests. In the cold months, the fire required constant feeding, and the family literally lived by its rhythm. In the morning, chopping; in the afternoon, hauling; in the evening, adding logs. Firewood gathering wasn't a winter task. It was a summer and autumn campaign, long and grueling, like a military operation. The work began right after harvest, when the ground hadn't yet frozen. Men and older boys would leave for the forest at dawn and return only at dusk, exhausted but pleased if they managed to fell a few sturdy trees. It was backbreaking physical labor, requiring constant tension. Calluses on the palms became as thick as bark, and muscles ached at night, but there was no other way to stay warm in winter. The main tool was the axe, a simple but almost sacred item. A well-sharpened axe was worth its weight in gold because it determined whether the family would freeze in January. Every tree was felled by hand, with calculation and care. First, they undercut at an angle, then made a notch in the opposite direction, and only then did the trunk begin to slowly lean, cracking and breaking branches. When the tree fell, it was cleared of branches and sawed into logs about human height. These logs had to be hauled home, which often turned out to be harder than felling the tree itself. Hauling firewood was an epic task in itself. If the family was lucky enough to have a horse, mule, or ox, part of the load could be hauled by sleigh or wagon. But more often than not, firewood was hauled by hand, through mud, snow, or slippery ground. People tied logs with ropes and dragged them over their shoulders, leaving deep tracks on the ground and sometimes tearing their hands to shreds. Sometimes logs had to be sawed right in the forest, with only short sections brought home to make the journey a bit easier. At the cabin, the second stage of labor began. The logs were sawed into pieces with a handsaw, a heavy two-man tool that required teamwork. One person pulled and the other pushed the blade back, and this rhythm accompanied every morning. Then the logs were split with the axe into firewood, and this determined the entire day. The firewood for the hearth or stove had to be the same length and thickness, or the fire wouldn't burn evenly. Every morning began with this monotonous but vital ritual. The sound of the axe was the sound of survival. The quality of the firewood mattered immensely. Experienced settlers quickly learned to differentiate wood by the sound of the strike and the color of the core. Hardwood, oak, hickory, maple, burned slowly, giving off dense, steady heat and almost no smoke. Softwoods, aspen, poplar, willow, flared up quickly and burned out just as quickly. This even affected the character of the flame. Hardwoods gave off a soft, steady glow, creating a feeling of calm. Green or wet firewood was a real disaster. It hissed, spat moisture, and covered everything with soot. It produced more smoke than heat, and the house was filled with a pungent smell. The worst part was that it released creosote, a resinous substance that settled inside the chimney. After a few weeks, this buildup could catch fire, causing the very blazes settlers feared most. That's why firewood had to be properly seasoned, dried for at least 3 months in the open air. The proper firewood pile was a science. It was placed on an elevated foundation to keep the logs off the ground and prevent them from absorbing moisture. Gaps were left between the rows for air circulation. On top, a layer of bark or boards was placed to protect the firewood from rain. Over the summer, the wood dried, becoming light and resonant when struck. A well-made firewood pile was a point of pride. It was a sign of the family's practicality and a gauge of how likely they were to survive the upcoming winter. But what about those who settled not in forests, but on the vast Great Plains, where trees were hundreds of miles away? These people faced a real fuel crisis. On the plains, nothing grew higher than the knee, and the only wealth was grass and bison. That's when settlers showed the kind of ingenuity that defined the frontier spirit. They found a replacement for wood, dried bison dung, known as buffalo chips. Collecting chips became a whole craft. Women and children would go out onto the plains with baskets and bags, gathering the dry patties left by the herds. They dried them in the sun and stacked them by the cabin wall. This material burned evenly, without soot, and with surprising heat, almost like coal. However, it required an incredible amount. To heat the stove for one night, you had to burn an entire bucketful. In winter, families spent their days replenishing the supply, regardless of the cold and wind. Buffalo chips didn't smell bad, as one might think, and became a true salvation for those living in treeless prairies. Thus, on the frontier, even fuel became a symbol of resourcefulness and endurance. Every log, every handful of chips wasn't just material, it was time bought from winter. And the higher the firewood pile stood, the better one slept at night when the icy wind howled outside the walls. Guess what was the main dish on a pioneer's table when the ground was covered in snow, and how they managed to avoid starving? As soon as the first snow fell, the earth stopped providing food. From this moment on, the family depended entirely on what they managed to accumulate and preserve. The main structure, apart from the house, was the root cellar. It was a pit dug in the ground, often directly beneath the floor of the cabin or near it. The walls were reinforced with stones or wood, and a thick insulated roof was placed on top. The secret of the root cellar lay in the use of geothermal heat. A few meters down, the earth maintains a stable positive temperature. This allowed vegetables to be stored without freezing, yet without sprouting. The root cellar held the primary calorie reserves: potatoes, turnips, carrots, parsnips, cabbage, and beets. These root vegetables made up the core of the winter diet. They were simply placed in boxes with sand or straw. Meat was another important part of the diet. The primary source was pork. In the fall, animals were slaughtered, and the meat was immediately preserved. The most common method was salting. The meat was rubbed with large amounts of salt and tightly packed into wooden barrels. This salted meat could be stored for months, but before use, it had to be soaked for a long time to remove the excess salt. Another popular method was smoking. Hams and bacon were hung in a special smokehouse or directly in the chimney. The smoke not only added flavor, but also acted as a preservative. Drying was also widespread. Fruits like apples were sliced and dried in the sun or by the stove. Meat was cut into thin strips and air-dried, making jerky a concentrated and lightweight source of protein. The winter diet was incredibly monotonous. Day after day, the table featured salted pork, cornmeal porridge or bread, and boiled potatoes. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruits often led to scurvy. Hunting for fresh meat in winter was possible only through hunting. It was a dangerous and not always successful pursuit. However, a successful hunt could provide the family with fresh protein for several weeks. Surviving in winter was a race to accumulate calories. But what was just as important as food? In the next chapter, we will discuss the main source of life, which became the main problem in winter. A person can survive for weeks without food, but without water, only a few days. In winter on the frontier, all water turned to ice. Ensuring the family had water became a daily, heavy, and dangerous task. The primary water source was the nearest stream, river, or well. When the frost set in, the river would freeze over with a thick layer of ice. Every day, settlers had to go out onto the ice with an axe. They would cut a hole in the ice, a hole large enough to scoop water with a bucket. This task had to be done daily, as the hole would freeze over again overnight. It was dangerous. The ice was slippery, and falling into the freezing water far from home was deadly. If the family had a well, the task was not much easier. The bucket and rope would freeze. The well's mechanism could freeze, and ice deposits formed on the well's walls. Carrying water into the cabin became the next challenge. Water was carried in heavy wooden buckets. In severe frost, the water could freeze in the bucket on the way back. Inside the cabin, there stood a wooden water barrel. It was one of the most valuable items in the house. It had to be kept close enough to the fire to keep the water from freezing, but not too close, or the wood would crack. This barrel required constant replenishment. The water consumption was high, for drinking, cooking, and washing. The family had to make several trips to the river every day. An alternative source of water was snow. At first glance, this seemed like a simple solution. There's plenty of it, and it's right on the doorstep. However, melting snow was an incredibly inefficient process. A whole bucket of packed snow would yield only a small amount of water at the bottom. To fill a kettle, a huge amount of snow was required, along with precious fuel to melt it. Moreover, snow wasn't clean. It could contain impurities and dirt. Such water had to be boiled before use, which again required fuel and time. Therefore, despite the abundance of snow, settlers preferred the difficult path to the river for live water. This daily battle for water was as much a part of winter as chopping firewood. When the temperature dropped so low that no fire could fully warm the cabin, the only protection was clothing. Pioneers understood the principle of layering. There was no one warm coat, but a system of several layers. The main fabrics were wool and linen, and later, cotton. Wool was a true miracle. It had the unique ability to retain heat even when wet, which was crucial for survival. Clothing was worn until it literally fell apart. Any hole or wear was immediately mended. Darning and patching were daily evening activities by the firelight. Nothing was thrown away. When clothes became too worn for repair, they were cut into pieces. These pieces were used to make patchwork quilts. The patchwork quilt was not just a decoration, but a vital element of survival. It was a multi-layered structure. The top layer was sewn from any available scraps: old clothes, flour sacks. Inside the quilt was the filling, or batting. This could be carded cotton, wool, or even just old worn-out blankets. Then all three layers, the top, batting, and bottom, were stitched together. Such a quilt was heavy, dense, and incredibly warm. It effectively retained body heat. In winter, there could be 5 or 6 such quilts on the beds. The beds themselves were simple. Often they were just wooden frames with a rope mesh. On top, they placed a tick, a large sack stuffed with straw, dry leaves, or corn husks. To survive the coldest nights, the entire family often slept in one bed. This wasn't about comfort, but survival. Bodies huddled together under a mountain of quilts generated and kept warmth. If the family was lucky, they might have furs or hides. A tanned bison hide was the epitome of luxury and warmth. It was used as a blanket or even hung on the wall for additional insulation from the cold log walls. Surviving physically was only half the battle. The other half was the much harder task: surviving mentally. Winter tested not only bodies but also minds, forcing people to battle silence and loneliness. It took away familiar comforts, destroyed the sense of time, and made every day feel like eternity. Isolation could last 4, 5, or even 6 months when the road to the neighboring settlement was buried under snow. Even the strongest spirits began to feel anxiety and fatigue from constant confinement. The family was locked in one small, dimly lit room, where every corner was familiar down to the finest detail. Outside, the wind howled, snowdrifts blocked the paths, and the house became an island in a sea of snow. A trip to the neighbors became impossible, as even a short distance could become a deadly trap. Sometimes the snow piled up so high that the doors couldn't be opened. People felt as if the entire world had shrunk to the size of their own dwelling. This state, which we would now call cabin fever, slowly but surely drained the mind. An enormous trial was the darkness. Winter days were short, and the sun seemed to appear for just a moment before disappearing behind the gray clouds again. During the long evenings, the only source of light was the fire in the hearth, casting trembling shadows on the walls. Sometimes tallow candles or oil lamps were lit, but doing so often seemed wasteful. Fat and oil were treasured like gold. People tried to conserve every bit of fuel, as they never knew how long winter would last. On such evenings, the house was filled not with light, but with twilight, where everything seemed dormant and tired. Monotony became the true enemy. Every day was the same. The morning began with lighting the hearth, the day was filled with chores, and the evening ended with a brief rest by the fire. The same food made from dried vegetables and salted pork became less and less tasty. The same faces around, the same stories, the same view from the window. An endless white wall of snow hiding the world. It was impossible to say what day of the week it was, and this feeling of endless repetition weighed more heavily than the cold. Time seemed to freeze, and each day felt like a mirror of the one before. To avoid losing their minds, families adhered to a strict routine where everyone had their place. Endless small tasks gave shape to the day and filled it with meaning. Men chopped wood, cleared snow from the entrance, cared for the livestock, and repaired tools that broke from the frost. These tasks weren't just chores, but ways to keep their sanity. In the sound of the axe or the creak of the file, there was comfort. Movement meant life. Even the simplest actions helped stave off apathy. Women had no less work. They cooked food, darned clothes, spun wool, knitted and made candles for lighting. In their hands, things were born that determined the survival of the whole family. Long hours at the spinning wheel, under the crackle of the fire in the hearth, passed slowly but filled the house with rhythm and warmth. The monotony of these activities gave a sense of stability, as though an invisible thread connected one day to the next. As long as the hands were busy, the mind didn't wander. Work became medicine for anxiety. Evenings turned into time for conversation and a small escape. After dinner, the family gathered by the fire, and if someone knew how to read, they would open a book. Most often, the Bible, the only one in the house. Reading aloud became an event. The voices sounded solemn, like in church. When the candles began to melt, they were replaced by stories about the old days, travels, wars, and miracles. Sometimes someone would pick up an old flute or violin, and music would momentarily bring the house to life. These moments of warmth and sound helped forget that outside, winter still raged. Storytelling was one of the main traditions. Adults shared memories of life before migration, of their home countries, and of old customs. The children listened with bated breath, and these stories became their first history lesson. Fairy tales and legends softened the long nights and were passed down from generation to generation as a family treasure. Sometimes the elders sang quiet, prolonged songs, and the whole house would fill with a sound like the whisper of the wind outside the walls. These evenings strengthened the sense of unity and helped survive the darkness. Hope for spring became the main psychological anchor. Even when the snow lay as high as a person, thoughts of the future didn't leave the people. Families made plans. They discussed which fields to plant, where to build a new barn, what to fix when the ice melted. Dreams of green grass, babbling water, and the smell of fresh earth gave them strength. Each day brought them closer to the long-awaited release from winter's grip, and this realization kept their inner fire burning. The smallest signs of approaching spring became true celebrations. The first drip from the roof, the crack of ice on the river, a patch of ground melted by the doorstep. All of this was seen as a miracle. People would go outside to hear the sound of the melting water, and in these sounds they heard the promise of new life. The sun rose higher, and its rays finally began to warm the skin after months of cold. These moments filled hearts with joy. Another winter had been survived, another trial had passed. Many settlers arriving on the frontier were immigrants from Europe. They came from Germany, Scandinavia, Ireland, England, and Eastern Europe, bringing with them not just modest belongings, but ideas of the world where there was no concept of boundless plains and relentless winds. They had winter survival experience, but it was the experience of a completely different European winter, where beyond the forest, the next village was always visible, where snow fell softly and melted with the first rays of spring. Back home, the cold was accompanied by humidity, but was bearable, and the wind rarely stripped to the bone. European winters were generally milder, wetter, and more predictable. On the continent, people could take shelter from the bad weather behind stone walls, and fields surrounded by forests protected them from strong winds. On the Great Plains, it was different. The horizon stretched endlessly, and nothing stopped the cold blowing in from the north. The frost here was dry and predatory, sinking into the skin, burning the breath, and feeling alive. Even on a clear day, the air was icy, and the wind, like an invisible knife, pierced through clothing as though it wasn't there at all. This was cold that Europe had never known. The first mistake many newcomers made was choosing a place to build their home. In summer, a plot by the river with a beautiful view and a soft breeze seemed perfect. There was plenty of water, fertile soil, and everything seemed peaceful. But when winter arrived, this same plot turned into a trap. The river froze, and the open space became a battleground for winds that roared across the plains like living hurricanes. Houses standing by the water found themselves in the center of an ice vortex, with the wind tearing heat out from every crack. Even the strongest wall shook from its force. The second mistake was underestimating the need for fuel. A settler used to European winters thought that 3 or 4 wood piles would be more than enough. He chopped as much as seemed reasonable, stacked the logs neatly, and waited for the cold. But by January, the firewood melted faster than the snow behind the stove. The frost was so severe that the fire had to be kept going around the clock. Otherwise, the temperature inside the house would become unbearable. People began burning everything that could burn. Old boards, furniture, pieces of fences. They understood that winter here was unlike any other. The third mistake was related to construction. Many wanted a roof over their heads quickly, so they built hastily, without proper insulation, with logs loosely fitted together, without thick chinking between the seams. In warm weather, such houses seemed perfectly livable. But when the frost hit, the walls turned into ice plates, drafts howled under the roof, and snow found its way inside through even the smallest gaps. Water in the buckets froze right in the house. Breath turned into steam, and they had to sleep in their clothes. Those who underestimated the importance of solid housing quickly realized the cost of their mistakes. The first winter became the harshest exam, an unforgiving filter that separated those who adapted from those who didn't survive the test. Many fell ill, lost livestock, and some simply didn't survive the cold. Their bodies were found in the spring when the snow melted, but the survivors learned quickly. They understood that other laws were in effect here, not human ones, but natural ones. Every mistake cost too much. Those who survived the first winter came out of it as different people, cautious, patient, and quiet. They learned that a sod house, which had seemed primitive and ugly, was actually much warmer and more reliable than a log cabin. The thick walls of earth held the heat, and the roof covered with sod and snow served as natural insulation. They learned from the Native Americans and more experienced settlers, learning to choose a house site not for its beauty, but for its protection from the wind. Experienced farmers advise placing the house in a low spot, near a hill, where the snow lays evenly and the wind doesn't whistle through the cracks. These tips saved lives. They discovered the value of buffalo chips, dried manure, which served as fuel when firewood ran out. In the treeless plains, it was the only way to stay warm. They realized that their firewood pile needed to be 3 times larger than it seemed necessary. They learned to build porches so the cold couldn't immediately enter the house, and they added extra layers of fabric and moss between the logs. All this seemed like unnecessary work until the storm arrived. Knowledge, earned through hard work and mistakes, became a matter of life and death. They discovered what a blizzard really was. Not just a heavy snowfall, but a roaring wall of white terror. The wind drove the snow with such force that it was impossible to see beyond an outstretched arm. The air whistled and howled, turning the world into an endless white void. People lost their bearings, couldn't find the way home, and fell just a few steps from safety. Children and animals died if they wandered too far from the shelter. After the first blizzard, settlers realized that winter here was not an enemy, but a force of nature that demanded respect. To avoid dying in this blinding storm, people stretched a rope between the house and the barn, a lifeline. They held on to it when they had to go out to feed the livestock or bring water. Even just 2 steps from the door, a blizzard could hide everything around. The rope, frozen and taut, became the only link to the house. Often it had the marks of hands desperately clinging to it in an attempt to return. This simple invention saved many lives, and soon no homestead was without it. We see that pioneer survival in winter wasn't a one-time act of heroism, but a complex system made up of thousands of small details. It was a war on many fronts, with the cold, hunger, isolation, and their own despair. Every aspect of daily life, from how the firewood was stacked to darning socks, was part of a unified strategy. A mistake in any of these seemingly insignificant tasks could lead to disaster. These families didn't rely on miracles, but on hard work, foresight, and incredible psychological resilience. They turned the earth into walls, steam from soup into heating, and scraps of old clothing into impenetrable armor against the frost. Their experience is a harsh reminder of what humans are capable of when alone with the wild. What other topics from the history of settling the American frontier would you like us to explore? Perhaps you're interested in the life of mountain trappers or the construction of the first transcontinental railroads? Share your ideas in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.